Hello everyone, Sakuya here, and welcome back to the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. And on today's episode, we are going to be diving into the history of vibrators. Yes, I'm not kidding. We're talking about the devices that are used for, sexual pleasure. Now, I know you're going to look at me weird, but you have to understand, when we're talking about the history of vibrators, these are things that originally were not designed for the purpose of sexual pleasure. Oh no, this was a tool that was designed for the health and well-being of the body and mind. But in order to understand how we got from that to the modern day iteration, well, you're just gonna have to listen to my story here. Okay, I'm just gonna say this right now because of all the terms that are in this video, I know that this whole thing is probably gonna get demonetized. So if you could please for the sake of the algorithm, like this video, comment, do anything you can to help it. It is a very interesting and fascinating one, but the topic itself is potentially going to hurt me here. Like this video. Now, you might have heard about how a doctor supposedly invented the vibrator as a method of treatment for hysteria, but that's not exactly how it happened. You see, there's a lot of myths and different misinformation surrounding the history of vibrators in the West, and it really all starts with Cleopatra. Yes, the Queen of Egypt, Cleopatra. You see, back in 1992, there was this encyclopedia of unusual sex practices in which an author by the name of Brenda Love claimed that Cleopatra had used a gourd filled with bees in order to, stimulate herself, similar to what is today a vibrator. Now, that idea has been repeated and reprinted and told time and time again in many different popular histories of vibrators, and it's a very common thing that you will see just posted in online articles or in little joke videos. But really, the thing is, there is no actual evidence that that happened. The book that claims this in the first place does not cite any kind of sources, and there really is no archaeological evidence of any kind to support this. No mentions of it as well. No mention of it in art or any kind of history or anything. And you would think that something like that would be something that people would really latch onto and talk about. I mean, just think about some of the stories that surround other female rulers and monarchs in history. No, instead, the beginning of this story seems to come first from the Greeks and their, quote, hysteria. Now, that term, hysteria, comes from the Greek hysterica, which means uterus, because it was back during the 6th century BC that there was a Greek physician by the name of Aristeas that had theorized that the womb within a woman's body could move freely around said body, and that when it would do so, this could cause all kinds of different effects, ill physicality, mental health issues, etc. And since then, quote, hysteria has been used in order to describe multitudes of different types of ailments, especially in women, ranging from aggression to fainting to even farting, which, I mean, I guess if you think about it in certain ways is one of those things, if anything. I don't think we're going to go into a deeper dive on that. You see, according to these theories and beliefs, hysteria would occur in women with pent-up sexual energy, or so healers and early physicians would believe. Nuns, widows, spinsters, and other people that were on the outskirts of society were particularly susceptible, which you can possibly imagine is due to the fact that they didn't have a partner for anything. But interestingly enough, by the Victorian era, many married women were also falling into the same issues. In fact, in the late 19th century, there were some physicians that were saying that as much as 75% of the entire American female population was possibly susceptible to this disease. Man, that is a lot of unsatisfaction. But then you may wonder, okay, well, how do they treat this hysteria? What is it that could be done with it? Well, the answer to that is a good old-fashioned finishing of them. The actual prescription of a, quote, orgasm as treatment for hysteria would date back to medical texts all the way from the 1st century AD. Hysterical women would typically then turn to doctors who would, quote, cure them with their hands by inducing a paroxysm, a term that hides what we now know today to be sexual climax. But the idea, I guess, behind this is that manual stimulation is something that could simply be too tiring and tedious for someone to do repeatedly, I guess. But then going into the 1800s and 1900s, things become significantly easier with the invention of a specific thing, electricity. And this is where the actual vibrator comes in. You see, the first electromechanical vibrator was a device that was called a percutor, this being something that was invented by British physician Joseph Mortimer Granville, either in the late 1870s or the early 1880s. Now, Granville thought that vibration, as in actual just vibrations rather than electricity, powered the human nervous system. And so he developed the percutor as a kind of medical device for stimulating ailing nerves. And the way this all relates back to women and hysteria then is that the current medical opinion at the time held that hysteria was a kind of nervous disease. But interestingly enough, Granville refused to treat female patients, quote, simply because I do not want to be hoodwinked by the vagaries of the hysterical state. As in, he didn't want to be tricked by women to providing something that he would be uncomfortable with doing. Possibly. Yeah, the first ever vibrator began as a kind of therapy for men only. Very quickly, though, this is something that left the kind of mainstream practice within medicine. But then by the early 20th century, manufacturers were selling vibrators essentially as ordinary electric household appliances. The merits of electricity in the home weren't really as obvious then as they are today. I mean, electricity, after all, was dangerous and it was expensive, but the idea of it promised excitement and modernity. Electric commodities like sewing and washing machines became hallmarks of the rising middle class. And the more things that you could have that were electrified, the better. And so it's into this market that vibrators come about. Vibrators were just another shiny new technology, something to be used to sell consumers on the idea of modern electric living. Funnily enough, just as banks handed out free toasters for opening checking accounts in the 1960s, in the 1940s, you had the Rural Electrification Administration that distributed free vibrators in order to encourage farmers to electrify their homes. These modern electric devices, though, were not thought of as sex toys. So whatever you're thinking when I'm continuously saying this word, please pause for a moment. This is not what we're talking about. It may sound surprising to you all, but the reality of it is that these appliances promised relief of a non-sexual variety. Users of all ages could use a vibrator in order to apply it to any body part without sexual intent. Vibrators would supposedly make housework easier because they would soothe the pains of tired housewives. It could calm the cries of sick children. It could invigorate the bodies of the modern working man. They could be applied to tired backs and sore feet, to the throat to cure laryngitis, the nose to relieve sinus pressure, and everything in between, or at least that is what the claims said. Vibration promised to calm the stomachs of colicky babies, to stimulate hair growth in balding men. It was even thought to help heal broken bones, which, pause, I just have to say, the idea of putting up a vibrating device to a broken limb that is probably very sensitive to the touch and vibrating it? Ow! The short is, it was a health device, even if it wasn't actually something that did 99% of what people said it did. I mean, we're talking about a phenomena that had advertisements everywhere, including in things like the New York Tribune back in 1910, which declared, "Vibration banishes disease as the sun banishes mist." In 1912, you had the Hamilton Beach New Life Vibrator, which came with a 300-page instructional guide titled Health and How to Get It. The idea that these things were being offered as a cure for everything from obesity to appendicitis to tuberculosis and vertigo was insanity, especially to the modern reader or listener. But there were a large number of people back then that really believed it. I mean, these vibrators were not standard medical treatment. They absolutely weren't. They were a kind of medical quackery that really did not deliver on the promises that they offered. But despite all of that being said, millions upon millions upon millions of these devices were sold all over the country. Now you may be wondering at this point, okay, wait, hold on. Is there not something that would stop people from making such blatant lies? Like, there's no kind of science or anything backing this up. How the hell is this being sold as a cure-all for this stuff? Isn't that something that like the FDA or something should stop? Well, we're talking about a really weird time in American history. It's a transitional point. You see, prior to this, in the 1800s, you had all different kinds of medical quackery cure-alls, snake oils, that could be pretty much anything, usually a combination between morphine, alcohol, and other types of opium, along with maybe harmful substances like lead and arsenic that supposedly could cure anything. But after the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act in 1906, things like these medicines became significantly harder to make and sell because they were being much more heavily regulated. But vibrators and other types of electrotherapy and other things, these were not covered by the law as they were not a type of medicine that was ingested. So it is these types of things that ended up taking the majority of the market that was left behind by other alternative medicines. Now, despite the fact that millions of these things were sold, it really is like the modern day where, despite the fact that all of these supplements and crystals and other alternative health things are sold and sell in the millions, not everyone buys it. In fact, the majority of people, and especially medical professionals, do not buy it at all. In 1950, as an example, the Journal of American Medical Association wrote that the, quote, vibrator business is a delusion and a snare. If it has any effect, it is merely psychology. The business itself was dangerous, but not because it was obscene or sexual, but because it was just bad medicine that didn't deliver on the promises that it made. The fact that these devices could also be used to pleasure oneself was pretty much just further proof that the entire thing was a fraud. I mean, you gotta hear me out on this. Nearly every single vibrator company in the early 20th century offered phallic attachments that would have been considered obscene if these things were sold as dildos. But instead they were presented as rectal or vaginal dilators, things that were supposed to cure hemorrhoids, constipation, vaginitis, cervicitis, and any other kind of illness that was localized in the genitals and the anus. These vibrator attachments, like the rectal applicator, would just offer dubious treatments for dubious diseases, remedies for ailments that could have potentially been caused by ruinous and prevalent masturbation. Because people still thought at that time that it was a really bad thing. Hell, a lot of people nowadays still think of it as a bad thing. I mean, masturbation itself was thought to cause all kinds of different diseases. We're talking things like impotence in men and hysteria in women. These masturbatory illnesses were just a standard idea in the early 20th century, with one of the surviving thoughts from it being that masturbating will make you go blind. And so it was that through the majority of the 20th century, these vibrators just remained something of a kind of innocuous quackery. There really was no harm, no foul necessarily, as long as you weren't using this device for specifically sexual purposes, even though it didn't really do anything for your actual medical state of health, I guess you could say. I mean, hell, by the 1960s, when the sexual revolution would occur and the invention of the pill, vibrators at that point were pretty much a forgotten relic. Just one of many outdated appliances that were used by the housewives of old. But then, in the 1970s, feminists would take the vibrator as a kind of tool of female sexual liberation, as a symbol. It is something that would continue on all the way until this modern day. And really, the rest, at that point, is history. Thank you very much for watching. Make sure to like this video, comment, do anything you can to help this video in the algorithm, because again, it is probably going to be butchered. And goodbye, guys.